What if one family, long before the Rothschilds, quietly controlled entire markets and reshaped global economics without ever appearing in the spotlight of traditional history narratives? Imagine discovering that the foundations of modern financial power were not built by the names we always hear, but by a dynasty that operated in the shadows, influencing trade routes, political alliances, and whole nations, with a precision that feels almost engineered. When we look back at the rise and fall of empires, we often focus on kings, armies, revolutions, and treaties, but behind every major shift, there is almost always an unseen economic force pulling threads, deciding which markets live, which collapse, and which nations rise to dominance. What if this forgotten family mastered that pattern centuries before global finance became a formal system? Their methods were not loud. They did not conquer with armies. They conquered with information, leverage, and the ability to position themselves exactly where political power and economic opportunity collided. As you hear this, you might wonder how such influence could remain hidden for so long. The truth is simple. History celebrates those who stand on the stage, not the architects who built it. And understanding the mechanisms behind their control reveals something far more unsettling about how global markets, currencies, and geopolitical strategies have always been shaped. Think about the cycles we see today. Economic crises that appear suddenly, currency shifts that feel orchestrated, and geopolitical tensions that conveniently benefit specific financial interests. When you recognize the hidden logic behind these patterns, you start to question how much of global history was truly organic and how much was engineered by those who understood leverage better than any empire. You ever felt like certain events line up too perfectly to be coincidence? That sense might not be wrong. Before we move deeper, let me know in the comments. What part of economic history always made you question the official narrative? Because understanding your perspective helps shape how we explore these hidden structures. And if this topic already opens your eyes, leave a like and check whether you're subscribed, so you do not miss the next layers of this story, because what comes next may challenge what you believe about power itself, leading us into the mechanisms that allowed this family to rise in the first place, setting the stage for everything that follows in this investigation. To understand how this family emerged, you need to picture the world at a moment when global trade was expanding faster than political systems could regulate it. Empires were stretching themselves thin across continents, markets were exploding with new opportunities, and financial institutions were still primitive, unable to stabilize the turbulence created by sudden economic shifts. This environment produced chaos for most people, but for a select few with the ability to read patterns others ignored, it became fertile ground for unprecedented influence. While nations argued over territory, this family focused on controlling the flow of value itself. They recognized that whoever controlled trade routes, capital movement, and information networks did not need banners or armies to dominate entire regions. Their rise coincided with a period when governments were desperate for reliable intermediaries. States needed merchants who could move goods across dangerous corridors, financiers who could stabilize debts, and strategic thinkers who knew how to position themselves between supply and demand before anyone else realized the opportunity existed. This family understood that markets were not merely systems for exchanging goods, but living organisms shaped by fear, scarcity, and ambition. They learned to anticipate disruptions before they appeared, taking advantage of political instability, regional conflicts, and imbalances in supply chains with a precision that seemed almost prophetic. Others saw crises, they saw leverage. Their influence grew quietly because they operated through networks rather than institutions. Instead of building an empire with walls or flags, they built relationships based on trust, discretion, and access to restricted information. While rulers struggled to manage internal rivalries and external threats, this family became indispensable. Governments relied on them to stabilize currency, shipments, secure essential resources, and navigate markets too volatile for traditional authorities to control. Over time, officials stopped questioning how this dynasty accumulated so much strategic power because they needed the results more than they feared the implications. And as their presence expanded from one region to another, they began shaping not only commerce, but also the geopolitical outcomes tied to that commerce. They learned that influencing a market could influence a nation, and that influencing several markets could shift the balance of power across continents. What appeared to be isolated economic decisions were in reality part of a larger design, a blueprint that positioned them above the turbulence, allowing them to grow while others were struggling merely to survive. It is here, in this subtle but decisive moment, that their true ascent begins, setting the stage for the mechanisms they would later use to control entire sectors with astonishing precision. As their influence expanded, the family began constructing an architecture of power that went far beyond traditional commerce. They understood that controlling a product was insignificant compared to controlling the systems that moved it. So they built a network designed to operate across borders, leveraging every weakness in global trade to position themselves not as participants, but as the invisible infrastructure that markets depended on. Their first strategic advantage came from mastering the flow of information. While governments relied on slow, fragmented channels, this family cultivated an intelligence network capable of mapping supply imbalances, political tensions, and currency fluctuations long before anyone else realized their importance. Knowledge became their leverage, and leverage became their currency. With this advantage in hand, they established logistical routes that outperformed even state-run operations. They invested in warehouses near ports, transport fleets across key regions, and intermediaries who could negotiate in environments where official authorities lacked access or trust. By eliminating gaps in the chain, they transformed themselves into the only reliable pathway through which certain goods or capital could move. And in moments of crisis, when wars, embargoes, or scarcity disrupted global supply lines, they were the only ones still functioning. Reliability in chaos became their trademark, and with it came dependency. But their power did not come solely from operational efficiency. It came from shaping incentives. They knew that markets are driven not by ideology, but by human behavior, and they learned to exploit the fears and desires that influence decision-making. They extended credit where governments hesitated, offered stability where institutions failed, and provided access to high-value commodities when no one else could. Over time, key players in politics, trade, and finance became quietly tied to them, not through loyalty, but through necessity. Those who relied on their capital or their roots eventually aligned their policies with the family's interests, often without realizing how much control they had ceded. Their dominance also emerged from the way they neutralized competition. Rather than confronting rivals directly, they waited for markets to strain under conflict or mismanagement, then stepped in with calculated precision. They bought distressed assets, secured exclusive agreements, and positioned themselves as indispensable mediators in disputes. By the time competitors understood what was happening, the family had already woven themselves into the structure of the market itself. Removing them would have meant destabilizing the entire system, something no government or merchant was willing to risk. And while their operations remained discreet, their influence expanded across multiple sectors, each reinforcing the next. Control in one market opened doors to another, and soon they were shaping patterns of trade that spanned continents. Their strategy was not domination through force, but domination through inevitability, a form of power that felt less like conquest and more like the natural outcome of global dynamics. And it is from this foundation that their relationship with political institutions would evolve, revealing how deeply their reach extended into the core of government decision-making, forming the next layer of their ascendancy. As their influence spread across regions and markets, the family began stepping into the political sphere not through public office or formal authority, but through the gaps left by fragile governments struggling to maintain stability. Institutions that were overextended, underfunded, or internally fractured found themselves relying on this dynasty to solve problems that officials could not handle alone. When bureaucratic systems slowed trade, the family accelerated it. When regional authorities failed to negotiate disputes, the family intervened with solutions that moved goods, money, and influence with greater precision than any state mechanism. Over time, what started as convenience turned into dependence, and that dependence became a quiet foundation for their ascent. Governments, especially those navigating volatile economic cycles, increasingly leaned on this family as intermediaries. They handled currency transfers that central banks could not stabilize. They financed infrastructure when treasuries were constrained by debt. They provided political leaders with access to networks that extended far beyond national borders. Each service strengthened their position, embedding them deeper into the administrative fabric of states. At a certain point, their involvement was not extraordinary. It was expected. Leaders began consulting them during crises, trusting their analysis over official advisors, because their predictions often proved more accurate and less politically filtered. This closeness allowed the family to shape policies indirectly, not through coercion, but through the simple fact that governments acted in ways that ensured continued access to the family's resources. Policies supporting trade expansion, tariff adjustments, diplomatic alignments, and even military decisions occasionally reflected the quiet influence of those who understood global markets better than the ministers responsible for managing them. Their reach was not ideological, it was structural. They supported whatever decisions kept commerce stable and predictable, and in return, their interests were woven into the laws and strategies of nations that never openly acknowledged how much weight their recommendations carried. Institutions reinforced this dynamic. Banks borrowed from the family when liquidity dried up. Ports prioritized their shipments to avoid destabilizing high-value sectors. Courts granted favorable rulings because their lawyers were known for navigating international law with unmatched expertise. With each reinforcement, the invisible web tightened. They did not need titles or crowns. Their authority emerged from necessity, and necessity is far more powerful than symbolism. Those who controlled essential flows became more influential than those who claimed political leadership, because in periods of uncertainty, survival always trumps sovereignty. What makes this stage of their rise so significant is how seamlessly it unfolded. Governments never declared partnership. Institutions never admitted dependency. Yet both operated as extensions of the family's strategic vision, often unknowingly. And as this alignment deepened, the family achieved something far more enduring than traditional power. They secured influence that could outlast political cycles, leadership changes, and even national crises, setting the stage for economic consequences that would ripple far beyond their generation. If you have noticed similar patterns in modern institutions or historical episodes, share your thoughts in the comments so we can track how these dynamics continue to echo through time, revealing how these hidden structures shape the next phase of their dominance. As their influence permeated institutions and governments, the effects began to spread across the broader economic landscape in ways that were not immediately visible to the public. Markets that once operated independently now reacted to signals the family engineered, often without realizing the source of the shift. Their control over trade corridors meant that prices, supply volumes, and even patterns of scarcity could be influenced with subtle adjustments to the flow of goods. While governments believed they were managing their own economic cycles, the more accurate truth was that they were responding to conditions shaped by a silent architect working behind the scenes. One of the most immediate consequences was the stabilization of markets that previously fluctuated wildly due to political conflict or regional disruption. But this stabilization came at a cost. With predictability came dependency, and with dependency came the quiet erosion of economic autonomy. Nations that relied heavily on the family's logistical or financial networks found themselves aligning their policies with global patterns that benefited the dynasty more than the local population. Over time, entire regions shifted their economic priorities to match the opportunities engineered by this invisible power, abandoning traditional industries or redirecting labor and capital into sectors that strengthened the family's reach. This restructuring created ripple effects across borders. When a market became profitable under their influence, capital poured in. When they shifted focus, those same markets collapsed almost overnight. These fluctuations appeared natural, the result of global competition or political instability, but they were often the product of deliberate recalibration. The family had mastered the art of creating momentum and withdrawing it strategically, positioning themselves to profit whether markets expanded or contracted. This ability to influence cycles gave them leverage no government could match. The consequences went deeper than market behavior. Social structures began to adapt to the conditions created by this economic transformation. Cities grew around the trade hubs they prioritized. Migration patterns followed the industries they supported. Entire classes of workers emerged, dependent on sectors that thrived only because the family ensured they remained valuable. And when these sectors eventually shifted or declined, the social upheaval that followed revealed just how deeply their influence had penetrated daily life. What appeared to be natural economic evolution was often the effect of a single family's long-term strategy. Even international relations felt the impact. Nations that competed for dominance found themselves indirectly negotiating through economic landscapes shaped by the family's decisions. Diplomatic friction intensified when access to trade routes or commodities became constrained by shifts the family initiated. In many ways, they became a quiet axis around which global tensions rotated, not because they sought political control, but because controlling economic foundations inevitably shapes geopolitical outcomes. And yet, despite all this, their presence remained largely invisible to those not directly connected to the world of commerce or finance. But the real significance of these consequences emerges when you observe how this influence prepared the ground for even larger transformations. Their long-term strategies did not simply adjust markets, they altered the trajectories of entire nations. And from this evolving landscape, a new stage of competition rose, one in which the family would confront rivals with ambitions just as vast, leading to conflicts that unfolded far from public view, shaping the next critical phase of their rise. As their dominance solidified across multiple regions, it became inevitable that rivals would emerge, each attempting to break the family's grip on essential markets. But the conflicts that followed did not look like traditional economic competition. These were not battles fought through price wars or public negotiations. They were subtle, strategic confrontations that unfolded in the shadows of global trade. Competitors tried to undermine their influence by forming alliances with political leaders, financing alternative routes, or attempting to replicate the logistical systems the family had spent decades perfecting. Yet every attempt revealed the same truth. This family had built an ecosystem so deeply embedded in the economic framework of entire regions that dismantling it was almost impossible. What made the family particularly dangerous to their adversaries was their ability to predict movements long before they materialized. Their intelligence network, refined through years of navigating volatile markets, allowed them to anticipate which factions posed real threats and which would collapse under their own ambition. When a rival merchant network attempted to seize control of a profitable corridor, the family quietly redirected supply flows, starving the competitor of resources until their operations failed. When political figures were influenced by groups aiming to disrupt the family's presence, subtle financial pressures and carefully timed shortages shifted public sentiment, weakening the opposition without ever revealing the true orchestrator. Their strategy relied less on confrontation and more on inevitability. They learned to weaponize economic fundamentals. By controlling access to credit, they could restrict a competitor's ability to grow. By adjusting supply in regions where rivals tried to establish dominance, they manipulated prices in ways that eroded profit margins, forcing competitors into desperate moves that exposed their vulnerabilities. Sometimes the family offered partnerships, knowing that joining forces would place rivals under their influence. Other times, they allowed competitors to overextend themselves, then absorb their assets when collapse became unavoidable. Governments, unaware of the invisible war unfolding beneath diplomatic exchanges, often interpreted these economic shifts as natural market cycles. They did not understand that the apparent instability was the result of targeted pressure applied with precision. Nations dependent on the family's networks inadvertently empowered their strategies by adopting policies favorable to their operations, thinking they were making pragmatic decisions. This alignment allowed the family to move against rivals with even more confidence, knowing that political structures would not intervene effectively. But the most remarkable aspect of these conflicts was the family's ability to maintain discretion. Rivals could suspect interference, but they struggled to prove it or respond effectively. By the time any pattern became visible, the damage was already done. Their challengers were either absorbed, dismantled, or pushed so far to the margins that their presence no longer mattered. Each victory strengthened the family's perception as an unshakable force, one that could not be displaced, even by well-funded or politically connected adversaries. Yet these hidden battles also shaped the family in ways few expected. With every conflict, they learned more about the fragility of the systems they controlled. They recognized that dominance required constant adaptation, not complacency. And as they expanded into even more complex sectors, the pressure of maintaining control began to expose internal weaknesses, vulnerabilities that would evolve into the seeds of their eventual decline, setting the stage for the next shift in their long, intricate history. For a long time, it seemed impossible to imagine a world where this family was not quietly shaping the direction of entire markets. Their influence felt structural, almost permanent, woven into trade flows and political decisions across continents. But every system, no matter how resilient, eventually encounters pressures it cannot fully control. Their decline did not begin with a dramatic collapse or a single catastrophic mistake. It emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly, from the very complexity that had once fueled their rise. Managing vast networks required constant adaptation, and while they were unmatched at navigating external threats, the challenges that grew within their own structure proved far more difficult to contain. One of the earliest signs of weakening came from generational transition. The original architects possessed a level of strategic foresight and discipline that is rare even among powerful families. But as leadership shifted to heirs who lacked the same instincts, internal disagreements became more common. Decisions once made with unified vision turned into compromises shaped by conflicting priorities. Some sought expansion into unfamiliar sectors, others pushed for consolidation, and the conflicting ambitions diluted the clarity that had defined the dynasty's earlier dominance. Rivals noticed these fractures, recognizing opportunities in the hesitation and inconsistency that had never existed before. At the same time, global markets were evolving faster than the family's established systems could adapt. New trade routes developed, often shaped by emerging technologies and geopolitical shifts that bypassed the traditional corridors they controlled. Rising commercial powers, armed with state support and modern infrastructure, no longer feared challenging entrenched systems. These rivals operated with speed and efficiency that eroded the family's advantage in logistics and intelligence. The world they once mastered, a world of fragmented power, slow communication, and negotiable borders, was disappearing, replaced by a landscape where influence required new forms of leverage. Institutional changes also played a decisive role in their decline. Governments that once depended on them began strengthening their own financial and administrative systems. Central banks matured, national industries stabilized, and regulatory frameworks expanded, reducing the need for private intermediaries. With transparency increasing and states asserting more authority over trade and credit flows, The family's discreet methods became less effective. They could no longer maneuver behind political curtains as easily, nor could they dictate outcomes through quiet negotiations. The world was modernizing, and modernization limited the shadows in which they had always excelled. Economic disruptions further exposed vulnerabilities. A series of downturns strained their capital reserves, weakening their ability to absorb losses or manipulate markets with the precision they once commanded. As margins narrowed, they were forced to make strategic retreats, abandoning sectors they had dominated for generations. Each withdrawal signaled opportunity for competitors, who moved quickly to occupy the space left behind. What had once been a fortress of influence gradually became a collection of isolated strongholds, each less stable than the last. And yet, their decline was not marked by a dramatic fall, but by a slow fading, a gradual erosion of relevance as newer powers rose. With clearer visions and stronger political backing, their legacy persisted, but their control slipped into history, raising larger questions about how influence evolves and what patterns repeat across generations. If this transition reminds you of similar declines in other historical or modern dynasties, share your perspective in the comments so we can explore how these cycles of power loss echo through time, shaping the next chapter in this unfolding narrative. Even after their power had faded, the systems this family built did not simply disappear. Influence on the scale they once commanded leaves structural footprints, and those footprints became part of the global economic architecture that followed. What remains today is not a direct legacy of control, but a network of ideas, mechanisms, and institutional habits that still shape how nations trade, negotiate, and structure their financial systems. The modern world inherited their logic, even if it forgot their name. For instance, the concept of stabilizing trade through private intermediaries, once a necessity created by their dominance, evolved into formal institutions that perform similar roles. Markets that once relied on their intelligence networks now depend on data-driven analyses, but the underlying purpose is the same: anticipate disruptions before they occur and position actors to benefit from them. The family's approach to risk management also became a template adopted by emerging commercial powers. In later centuries, they showed that controlling supply chains was more valuable than controlling any single commodity. And this philosophy echoes today in multinational corporations that structure their influence not around products, but around entire logistical ecosystems. The idea that power lies in the infrastructure behind the exchange rather than the exchange itself is one of the most enduring imprints of their reign. Modern firms and state-backed enterprises alike build strategies around this principle, often unaware that a forgotten dynasty pioneered it long before global markets reached their current scale. Their influence even shaped political behavior. The model of aligning economic incentives with political needs became a quiet foundation for contemporary statecraft. Governments today routinely form partnerships with private entities to secure resources, stabilize markets, or navigate geopolitical tensions, mirroring the relationships once forged between this family and early states. These collaborations may not resemble the discrete negotiations of the past, but they carry the same underlying truth. Economic leverage often guides political outcomes more than ideology or formal authority. Another enduring remnant of their empire lies in the cultural expectation that markets should function with a degree of predictability, even during periods of instability. Their role in smoothing trade during crises set a precedent that persists in central banks, regulatory bodies, and international organizations tasked with preventing volatility. The belief that order can be maintained through deliberate intervention traces back to methods they perfected when formal institutions were not yet capable of doing so. As a result, many modern mechanisms for managing economic crises reflect patterns they established centuries earlier. Yet, perhaps the most subtle echo of their legacy is found in the way global competition unfolds. Their story revealed that influence is rarely secured through force alone. It is built through adaptability, strategic alliances, and control over information flows. Today's economic powers operate with sophisticated networks, advanced communication systems, and multi-layered supply chains, all of which mirror the structural logic this dynasty once used to dominate entire regions. What appears modern is often an evolution of foundations laid in a much earlier era. These remnants form an invisible map of influence, shaping decisions and structures that define global markets today. And as we continue tracing the patterns connecting past and present, another layer of comparison becomes unavoidable, one that reveals how their legacy helped pave the way for other dynasties that would rise afterward, setting the stage for a new era of financial power. As the remnants of their influence continued shaping economic structures long after their decline, observers began noticing striking parallels between this forgotten dynasty and the powerful families that emerged in later centuries. These similarities were not coincidences. They reflected recurring patterns in how wealth, information, and geopolitical leverage consolidate into lasting influence. The mechanisms that defined the family's rise became the blueprint for many who followed, whether intentionally or through the natural evolution of market behavior. When you compare their strategies to those of later financial titans, you begin to see a continuum rather than isolated episodes of dominance. The methods change with technology and political context, but the underlying logic remains remarkably consistent. Consider the Rothschilds, often cited as the epitome of financial power in Europe. Their control over information networks, bond markets, and international finance mirrors the earlier dynasties' command of trade routes and supply corridors. Both understood that speed of information could determine the fate of markets, and both built systems that allowed them to predict shifts long before governments reacted. The difference is scale. The Rothschilds operated in a more connected world with emerging financial institutions, while the earlier dynasty forged its influence in a landscape where private networks had more power than many state bureaucracies. Yet the structural resemblance between the two is undeniable. Other financial families, from merchant dynasties in the Middle East to banking houses across Europe and later industrial magnates in the United States, followed similar trajectories. They identified moments of instability, inserted themselves as indispensable intermediaries, and used strategic alliances to solidify their position. This pattern is not unique to one culture or era. It reflects a universal principle of economic history. When markets expand faster than institutions can govern them, private actors step in to fill the void, and those with the broadest vision rise the highest. The Oudil, forgotten family at the center of this narrative, simply mastered this principle earlier, and with a level of sophistication rare for their time. Even modern corporate empires echo the same dynamics. Multinational conglomerates that control logistics, technology, or data operate with influence that resembles the old dynasty's reach across trade corridors. Just as the family understood that power came from controlling the infrastructure behind economic exchange, today's global giants derive strength from managing networks that nations themselves depend on. And in both cases, the influence tends to look organic from the outside, when in reality it is built on deliberate long-term strategy. The parallels extend beyond commerce. Political movements throughout history have relied on strategic funding, information channels, and private intermediaries who remain behind the scenes while shaping outcomes that appear public and democratic. The earlier dynasty demonstrated how economic influence could quietly guide political decisions without ever being formally recognized. Later power structures adopted this model, refining it into systems so embedded in governance that distinguishing between political authority and economic leverage becomes nearly impossible. By examining these parallels, it becomes clear that the story of this forgotten family is not an isolated historical curiosity. It is an early chapter in a much larger pattern, one that repeats wherever private networks evolve faster than the institutions meant to regulate them. Their rise set a precedent, and their legacy framed the strategies of every dominant financial force that followed. And understanding these continuities reveals why such structures persist today, laying the groundwork for the final reflection on what these cycles mean for the present and the future. When you step back and trace the arc of this dynasty's rise and fall, a larger pattern begins to emerge, one that extends far. Beyond any individual family or era, their story shows how economic power accumulates quietly, often in places where institutions are weakest and global systems are still taking shape. It shows how private networks adapt more quickly than governments, how influence grows in the gaps left by political uncertainty, and how those who understand structural vulnerabilities can shape outcomes that appear natural to everyone else. What makes this narrative even more striking is how familiar it feels when compared to the dynamics unfolding in the world today. Markets still respond faster than parliaments. Corporations still operate across borders with a fluidity that governments struggle to match. And those who control the flow of information, capital, or logistics still wield disproportionate influence over global events. The family's journey highlights a deeper truth about modern society. Power rarely announces itself. It operates through infrastructure, relationships, and systems that appear neutral until you look closely at who benefits from their design. Even after centuries, the logic they perfected continues to guide how supply chains are built, how financial institutions manage risk, and how geopolitical strategies are crafted around economic leverage rather than ideological conflict. The world we inhabit is, in many ways, an updated version of the environment they once dominated. Technology has changed the pace, but not the underlying architecture. And perhaps the most revealing takeaway is how cycles of power repeat. The rise of one dominant actor inevitably invites challengers. Systems become more complex until they strain under their own weight. New players emerge with strategies better suited for the next era, reshaping the landscape just as dramatically as those who came before them. It is a reminder that economic influence is neither permanent nor accidental. It is built through vision, maintained through adaptation, and lost through complacency. Understanding this cycle helps explain not only the past, but the forces driving the present global economy. If this journey through hidden economic patterns helped you see the structures of power with more clarity, consider leaving a comment with the phrase, "I'm here until the end, so I know you followed every layer of this story." And if the value in these insights resonates with you, subscribing to the channel ensures you stay connected as we explore the next chapters of how global influence is constructed and manipulated. A simple like also helps this content reach others who are trying to understand the deeper mechanics of history. There is another video waiting beside this one that expands on these ideas from a different angle. So if you want to continue uncovering the foundations of modern power, click through and follow me there as we keep unraveling the patterns shaping the world today.